giving this a 9.5 and an Editor's Choice Award. Both no-brainers.
So, this isn't a review of Death Stranding.
This game sucks. Book written on game design and often...
The way we talk about video games, or any art form, is an ever-evolving process. As our language and ideas shift with social consciousness and new ideologies, the language we use changes as well. My childhood memories of reading articles about games mainly consist of news about upcoming game releases or reviews. I used these articles to help shape what I would ask my parents for come Christmas and birthday time. I would spend hours poring over IGN articles to see what my annual haul of games should be, since my birthday and Christmas are so close together. It took a lot of careful planning that usually came down to the yearly Tony Hawk or Medal of Honor release. Sometimes The Sims or Civilization will be thrown in there. The point I'm trying to make here is that every piece about video games that I read, watched on TV, or saw online was about why I should buy a game rather than what made it tick. My current self could not be much further from that reality. Welcome back to the language of video games. Today we're going to look at how we talk about games, by examining the way conversations around games have changed over the years. I know a lot of this will be purely anecdotal since many people enter the discourse of games analysis at different points, but I do think there are some important milestones to dissect in how we engage with the medium of discussion that shaped how we analyze and construct our ideas surrounding video games. It's important to look at the how, the why, and the what of games discussions, and the value we as creators and consumers put on those pieces. Otherwise, stagnation is always going to happen. Since this video relies on a lot of experiences that were personal to each one of us with how we consume games media, I decided to ask a bunch of friends their own stories with their personal journeys through the way we talk about games and how that's changed.
My name is Rasputin. I make video essays on stuff. Mostly games, sometimes TV shows and books and musicals, but mostly games, looking at game design and writing in games.
Well, I'm Maria. I am Eurothug 4000 on YouTube, and I make video game analysis videos.
In both real life and on the internet, my name is Jacob Geller, and most people probably know me from making videos on YouTube about mostly games and then kind of increasingly other weird stuff as well.
My name is Nico Blakely, and I host the Writing on Games cast along with Hamish Black. It's an offshoot of the Writing on Games YouTube channel.
So I am Hamish Black. I run the YouTube channel Writing on Games. It's a YouTube channel, about game design and narrative and the analysis thereof.
I'm Joseph Anderson. I have a YouTube channel, and I also stream. Still getting used to being a streamer, even though I've been doing it for over 2 years. And I make video game critiques and sometimes reviews, but mostly they're critiques, and they're looking at games as how successful they are as an art form instead of how successful they are as a product. That's usually what my videos are.
I'm Bob Dunga. I do video game essays and a lot of retro rewinds about old nostalgia.
With much older forms of art, there has always been room for opinion pieces. Even in those old-timey newspapers, journalists and reviewers would weave greater cultural context into reviews of movies, books, television shows, and albums to explain the how and why it did or didn't land for them. We have higher education courses dedicated to studying film, music, and books, but when it comes to games, it's generally just design. Not to say those papers don't exist, just not in their own 3-year bachelor to major in. These outstretched ideas of explaining the what of today helps people connect. It's easy to say something is technically good or bad, but that never paints the full picture. A poorly made film can still be enjoyable to an audience that can find a way to connect with it. So bringing in those ideas is always going to be an invaluable part of the greater culture surrounding a medium. Video games, by comparison, are an incredibly young style of media, still finding their footing in the world, despite being the biggest and fastest growing one of them all. And that growth is detrimental to the ideas people try to bring forth. And people have been scrambling to keep up with the newer ideas that are constantly being pushed forward. This isn't to say those review pieces of old I used to diligently read were devoid of personality or opinion. So criticism and discussion can never be objective, no matter how hard some will try to convince you otherwise. After the video game crash of 1983, Nintendo was able to resurrect the gaming industry by marketing games as toys, specifically for young boys. So reviews were a quick glance at the back of the box for parents to look to see if spending their hard-earned money was worthwhile or not. The target demographic wasn't exactly out to seek more intellectual readings of Super Mario Bros. Or Kirby. Generally speaking, games were bright, colourful, and played well enough to occupy time. Even games geared towards the older audience, like Ninja Gaiden and Contra, weren't exactly breaking down barriers of what was known about the medium. They were just dumb, schlocky 80s action films that you could play, and that was awesome. That kind of catharsis was all that's needed after a long day's work, so why delve deeper? After all, they're just toys, right? What was the point of a greater contextual op-ed of a children's plaything? As technology advanced at an ever-rapid pace, developers could do more and more with their games. But in an age before widespread internet culture, those deeper readings didn't really have a place. Published magazines were still king in the 90s, and cost a lot of money to make. So they were, generally speaking, printed by consumerist companies that dominated the medium, which is fine. They were a fun way to showcase games, talk about release schedules, have written in letters, and so on. This isn't to say people weren't making these connections or having those conversations. It just largely amounted to water cooler talk.
There was definitely work being done, but I think it was because the internet wasn't nearly as centralized as it is now and stuff. It was just much harder to find those things. You know, now I can find people doing really niche, interesting writing because like someone I follow will tweet about it or whatever. And so it's not that the writing didn't exist, but like the connections just weren't there at all.
Back then, it wasn't, the production values weren't particularly high. It was kind of a lot of people ranting somewhat incoherently about, you know, the gameplay gets a 10 and the graphics are real good, so that gets a 10. And it was that kind of thing, you know. It was they broke it down with graphics and fun factor and all that kind of stuff. You know, it was that kind of thing. It was very segmented, and it was, you know, it wasn't super in depth or anything like that.
Mid-2000s young Mitch always wanted to be a games reviewer, which in hindsight makes sense, since most of my free time that wasn't playing games or outside skateboarding was wasted reading reviews. I frequented sites like IGN, GameSpot, and ScrewAttack for what games to buy, all sectioned off into different categories like gameplay, presentation, graphics, and story, all summarized by a scale score at the end.
And that's especially annoying with like scoring systems, because you have to be objective, but video games aren't really an objective medium at all. Like, no medium is really. It's all about subjectivity, so yeah, numbers don't work. We all know that, but...
Review scores serve as a quick, too long, didn't read summation of a game, with some bullet points and some criticism, compliments, and comments at the end. The issue comes with the dreaded perfect score, the 10 out of 10. Nothing can be perfect, and review sites like IGN acknowledge this. Under their game review scoring part of the website, equating a 10 to a masterpiece and stating, "Those that earn a masterpiece label from IGN come as close as we could reasonably hope for." This shows that subjectivity does exist even in perfect scores. Despite this, there are constantly many exhausting debates on the topic. One example that has stuck with me for over half of my life at this point is IGN's review of Twilight Princess for the Wii. Matt Casamassina gave the game a 9.5 out of 10, which is, you know, only 0.5 off a perfect score for the site. There was a comment complaining that it was too low for a Zelda game, citing that previous console Zeldas Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask scored a perfect 10 and 9.9 respectively.
The Alien Isolation score, that sticks in my mind, and it makes me very angry. Because I think they gave it like a 6 or a 5 point something, I don't know, it was just stupid. And then I think it's an issue because, I mean, they're just a collection of reviewers, right? And they just put whoever on whatever project depending on availability and stuff like that, when really it should be you're putting reviewers on games that they understand the genre of. Because I think what they did was they put someone who wasn't really into survival horror games and didn't really understand, like, I guess why they interest people and stuff like that. So when they reviewed it, they hated it because they're used to more like action type games rather than being helpless against like the xenomorph. So it's obviously they were going to give it a bad score because they personally didn't like it, because they personally don't like that genre, which is just another reason why scores don't work.
like going on IGN to check reviews for games. And almost never to check to see like if a game I was on the fence about like got a good score to get it. It was always like, all right, did this game that I like get a 10? You know, like always to self-affirm what I wanted.
The idea of self-validation through review scores is something that we still see today, and positive and negative reviews have been weaponized against developers and publishers. Nowadays, if they do something a certain small but very loud demographic of extremely online folk don't agree with, there is almost certainly going to be a knee-jerk reaction in the form of review bombing their Steam or Metacritic pages to make a stand, as it were. These usually come in the form of an entitled sense of ownership over a game. When Metro Exodus was announced to be an exclusive for the Epic Games Store, many took to the earlier entries in the series to express their disdain for the decision. But we as a community don't own shares in these companies. We purchase their products and enjoy what's been released, or we don't. Criticism of the games themselves are all well and good, but when it comes to any monetary decision on the developer's end as to how their game actually gets made and released, well, that's just not up for us to be the deciders on. The other big issue with the format of standard reviews and scores is that it lacks a lot of the nitty-gritty personality that a lot of those who engage with media surrounding games crave. Personality in games criticism is incredibly important, but let's get back to that later. We still have some stuff in the past to cover.
Even gaming magazines used to be more edgelord back in the day. You know, like if you go back and read some, I mean, it's like, and even Game Informer, which is a pretty high watermark for like editorial standards or whatever, wrote shit and used words that you would like never use in a publication today. And so it had this like very just kind of like bro-y, like, yeah, you know, we're all gamers and we don't have time for society's rules kind of vibe.
As stated earlier, Nintendo began advertising their game consoles as toys, and specifically for boys. The effects of this were immediate both in game advertising and culture. Among all the hyper-masculine and edgy dude bro humor, female leads in games were overly sexualized in publications, even going so far as to have Lara Croft do a sexy shoot in a men's lifestyle magazine Loaded. Playboy also had a 5-year running series showcasing the women of video games stripped down. It's genuinely uncomfortable to look back on. This was about the time the medium was hitting its teens, and things like nude character shoots in magazines and edgy articles were a lot of the reason the industry took so long to be taken seriously as an art form. The apathetic yet in-your-face attitude of Gen X during the 90s was an interesting time for gaming to hit its adolescence, and the market reflected that attitude perfectly. Gamers were growing up and games were growing with them. We hit the nudie mag under the bed era of games, and we kept one eye alert at the arcade to make sure mum didn't catch us playing Mortal Kombat.
And some parents think it's just too violent for their kids, keeping violent and sexual images away from kids.
Mortal Kombat changed the world of video gaming.
And, well, Mortal Kombat changed everything. Its hyper-violence perked up the ears of news outlets and parents everywhere. Prior to its release, news reports surrounding games were about the NES being the hottest toy for children. Reports of a game that wasn't for kids felt like whiplash to the mainstream non-gaming audience. Since Mortal Kombat was mainly relegated to cabinets and arcades worldwide, parents didn't really have control over what their kids were playing, and huge pushes were made to get it outright banned. This led to the creation of the ESRB and its rating system. This original controversy is the beginning of how discourse surrounding games can affect their development. Nintendo had been interested in releasing Mortal Kombat on the SNES. However, due to the brutal nature of the game, it would not fit into the mostly family-friendly library. Nintendo demanded to change the blood from red to green and edit the fatalities to be less obscene. Gregory Fishback, chief executive for Acclaim, told the BBC that this was the coming of age for video games. At one point, video games were meant to be for children, and nobody really took them seriously. But it was with the release of Mortal Kombat that people who controlled the media began to look at it differently. Between the excessive violence of Mortal Kombat, the crude humor of games media, and the over-sexualization of women we play as, it's no surprise it took so long for the medium, and by extension, criticism of the art itself took so long to become a legitimate path to pursue.
Welcome to GameSpot TV, your ultimate guide to computer and video gaming. I'm Adam Sessler.
In 1998, GameSpot TV, later renamed XPlay, launched with host Adam Sessler to incredible success. seen around the world on actual televisions in actual people's living rooms. We could get our media coverage of games outside of magazines and dial-up internet. From the success of X-Play, a series of similar shows around the world began cropping up, proving that games journalism, or at least the hype and spectacle of it, could be taken seriously. When it comes to consuming media around games, especially in today's digital landscape, everyone starts their journey into exploring media surrounding games somewhere. And usually that somewhere is different depending on a myriad of factors. Location, age of exposure to your first console or gaming PC, an interest in reading outside of just playing, and so on. So before we go further into this, I think it's important to go over where we all started our journey to help put some perspective on who we are and how our backgrounds can and do affect our point of view when it comes to discussing gaming at large.
I probably started getting into games media. I mean, there's different levels of it, right? Like when I first started playing games media, to my knowledge, was mostly just reviews of stuff. When I'd say like I actively was like, this is something I'm interested in, I'm gonna spend more time looking stuff up and watching videos on stuff, probably started around like 2010, yeah. And I got into it like through Minecraft. I remember seeing an article about like how the millionth player had signed up for Minecraft, and I was like, oh, I've never heard of this game. And then I looked up a video and it was X's Adventures in Minecraft, and I was like, oh shit, this game's cool. And I remember watching his like Let's Play of it, and it's kind of like that led me into other people's Let's Plays, which eventually led me to like Rooster Teeth's Let's Plays of it, which, you know, that's just, Rooster Teeth has so much fucking content in general, which kind of shifted it to more like analysis videos. Actually, I think it was more like when I watched Let's Plays through there, it kind of eventually led to me watching Game Grumps, which, you know, at the time, I think that I got into. I remember at the time I got into it was like right during the changeover. But once I started watching that show, it was like, oh, there are other things that the people involved in this do, you know? So that's when I got into sequelitis.
To be honest, it was mainly through YouTube. So I remember the first person I really watched who was really into video game analysis was Jacob Geller. He was kind of the first person that I watched that spoke about games in a way that I had never seen before, because I was so used to reviews and that kind of template and that restriction. But when he spoke about, I think it was Super Mario Galaxy was the first one that I saw, and it just, because I played that game as a child and I always had that feeling from that game, but I could never put it into words how I felt, and he did it so well and explained it with the mechanics and everything, and that was just really inspiring. So yeah, I owe it all to Jacob.
So before I even had a game console, I can't remember if I had subscription to Game Informer or I had friends who I would just borrow the magazines from, but I was like reading about games before I was even playing them. You know, I would just kind of like just pour over like reviews and stuff of things I had never played, and so really from the very first moment that I was like aware of games as a thing, I was reading about them. And then kind of as time got on, I got really into like game facts. I would just read, you know, the message boards there, but also just kind of read the FAQs themselves that people had written, and kind of branching out onto the internet from that starting point.
Probably the magazines. I read a lot of EGM, Game Informer, because you just got a Game Informer subscription anytime you went to EB Games or GameStop. And Die Hard Game Fan are like the earliest memories I have of actually consuming games writing.
So I guess I first got into games writing, as in reading games writing. Like my first memories of it are the official PlayStation magazine, which I started getting into pretty soon after I got my PlayStation back in like 96 or something like that. Basically because it had demo discs and that meant more games to play. It was, you know, I didn't actually like read a lot of the reviews. I was basically just getting these magazines for the demo discs, and like I'd look at the scores of games and be like, I want that one, and then inevitably not get it because my parents were like, we can't afford that. So yeah, it was so that was kind of my first like memory of actually engaging with like print and stuff. It would later become, yeah, I would actually start to read the reviews and stuff that would come along with it for bigger games and all that. But yeah, I mean, back then it was a case of like video stuff didn't really exist in the same way, so like we didn't have like internet access for ages, so so screenshots in those magazines would be like the window into what these games actually looked like. It was we didn't really have access to video. That was until I started going around to my friend's house and they had dial-up and all that, and we would basically just sit and wait for ages as GameSpot reviews would load. So the actual my first memory of like really engaging with, you know, like personality based games writing and video and all that,
a magazine for sure. And it was I think Nintendo Power or Official Nintendo Magazine. It was mostly into Nintendo stuff early on, and it wasn't until I was into my teens that I got into PC and PlayStation, that sort of thing. So yeah, I think Nintendo magazines, the Official Nintendo Mag in the UK, and I don't remember reading any Nintendo magazines or anything like that in Canada. So it was definitely when I moved back to the UK. So probably around, I'm gonna say 10 years old is when I first started reading those kind of magazines.
Well, I used to watch that show. I think it was called G4 TV. There weren't a lot of shows back then that would talk about like video game news, and like they wouldn't just like review games. They would also go into depth and like talk to developers and stuff. And I think that was like my first like earliest exposure to like beyond just sitting at home and playing games.
With only TV shows like X-Play in the early 2000s to get my news about what was coming up and what was happening at industry events like E3, my scope of what games media could be was incredibly limited to these binary of news and reviews. The deepest discussion I found were on forum posts, made by fans. We would talk theories, ideas, and the nitty-gritty of what made games tick, but it never really occurred to me that there would be more content like that to be found, whether that was from sheer ignorance or just what I, on some deeper level, secretly craved from random strangers on the internet satiated. So there wasn't that need to seek it out. Deeper analysis was available on the internet. It's a deep and vast place, but analysis didn't sell back then. Otherwise, op-ed pieces would have been front-page click-throughs for people like me to sink their teeth into. This doesn't make anything about these outlets objectively bad, it's just priorities are different, and money does need to be made at the end of the day. Today, a lot of popular websites are full to the brim on thought pieces analysing the way we play, the stories behind games, and just what makes something fun, all intertwined with those aforementioned reviews and news.
There was this eco plot analysis on GameFAQs. It's like a, I don't know, 50-page just kind of essay on the themes of eco and how the game communicates those themes through its gameplay. And it was written in something like 2004, and you know, if I read it again today, I think it would probably be, you know, pretty normal long form game critique. But I had absolutely never seen, you know, people talking about games being in conversation with fairy tale tropes, or games being in conversation with like classic film, which the guy referenced a lot. And so just the idea that if you wanted to, you could go as deep as you wanted on this sort of thing, was just kind of crazy and revelatory to me.
I have spent a fair amount of time trying to find early examples of more critique and analytical style writings in the Wild West days of the internet, and outside of the surprisingly poignant GameFAQs write-up that Jacob mentioned, there isn't really much to be found, at least not easily. But in 2004, video changed. It went from something that was strictly professional like the newsroom shows, or purely functional, basically video versions of IGN and GameSpot's coverage of games.
For real, I'm actually being dead serious. Dead fucking serious. That's brilliant, right?
Then, James Rolfe, better known as the Angry Video Game Nerd, released a video about Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest for the NES, absolutely ripping it to shreds through a series of comedic sketches, references to other medias, and gags.
The first major personality I saw on YouTube that was discussing video games was the Angry Video Game Nerd. I think that's going to be the first one for quite a few people. And that got me thinking a little bit about like, oh, okay, I didn't realize that this could be a thing, that people could make videos online and put them on YouTube and everything. That was a very, very new thing.
I think Angry Video Game Nerd, and even though, like, what changed it for me was that he didn't do traditional A to Z sort of reviews. He managed to sort of merge it with entertainment and comedy rather than it just being like a straight review of a game. So like when I saw that he was able to do that, then it kind of changed the way I wanted to tell stories about games, or the way I wanted to discuss games as well.
AVGN's influence was unheard of. He showed an entire generation that a DIY approach to video was entirely possible, and foreshadowing the rise of YouTube. For the early years, YouTube was full of comedic game reviewers doing their own thing for fun. There was no money to be made on the platform, so it was out of the pure love of the craft, pioneered by channels like Mega64, The Irate Gamer, Spoonie, and later channels such as Peanut Butter Gamer, The Completionist, and Did You Know Gaming. These ideas were pushed further, forming their own niche on YouTube, really making it a mainstay of the platform. Despite the low production values, the reliance on humor as a means to tell a story really connected with people. It helped give these creators a personality and really start to thrive within their new scary world of amateur video. Outside of video, back in the area of the written word online, something else was happening. One of the most popular to hate terms within games discourse was born in 2007, ludonarrative dissonance. Not from a popular website opinion piece, but on the website Click Nothing by Clint Hocking, discussing how he felt Bioshock's mechanics directly opposed the story it was trying to tell, leading to widespread discussions on how games as an art form are separated into two different chunks: gameplay and storytelling. These ideas weren't really helped by reviewers, especially at the time, dissecting their scoring system into chunks that separated games into portions rather than one conducive experience. Reviews sectioning themselves off isn't why games have opposing ideals when it comes to the language of gameplay and the story they're trying to tell. But it didn't help the way we talked about games. The very idea of mechanics telling a story is, to many, a foreign concept. So with ludonarrative dissonance came a bunch of people pointing at games' flaws in this regard, and it was a hot button topic in these circles for a while. But with every big movement comes the kickback reaction to it, and what was left was an even middle ground where now mechanics can actually tell the story, if we let them. Video games are limited in their execution, but that's where the way we can talk about them comes in to fill the gaps left behind from a ceiling in making games.
It's surprising that we're so many decades into gaming being like a big thing, and we still struggle to have the language to describe proper things. I feel like video game fans or gamers, if we're allowed to say that word, are gamers are argumentative by nature. So if someone tries to like coin a phrase or a term and be like, this is what this means, a bunch of other gamers will be like, nah, screw that, you know? Like we argue over like things like roguelike versus roguelite, you know what I mean? Like that distinction is worth having a big fight over. So it's hard to nail these kind of terminology down. So but I think it will happen, and I think at that point we're gonna be able to describe games better, and I think that will be the next big shift.
Genre discussions might be the bane of any game's criticism, and it's been happening for the longest time now. Ever since Doom in 1993, first-person shooters were simply called Doom clones, later becoming corridor shooters, before finally settling on FPS. Between Metroidvania and Souls-like, game discussion gets held up at the first hurdle, the genre distinction. It's easy to see why language has taken its sweet time evolving and developing on its own, instead still relying on terms from film theory. This isn't to say that using film theory intertwined with games analysis is a bad thing. It's not. In fact, some of the best writing has been done with this.
There were a couple of things that really shifted my idea of like how deep you could go with things. It was so I guess the first one would have been Adam Sessler's review of The Last of Us back when he joined Rev 3 Games. So I didn't really grow up with like G4 or anything like that, so I wasn't hugely aware. I knew Adam Sessler's name, but I hadn't really seen much of his stuff. That like, I kind of binged on a lot of that stuff later on. Like I remember being in a fucking hostel with my now flatmate up north, watching like sitting there watching this review of The Last of Us and thinking, man, this guy's talking about fucking you know, the fallacy of anthropocentrism and stuff like that. And I'm like, man, he's like, I was reading, you know, a bunch of academic essays about the you know, zombies and popular culture and all that stuff. And I was like, what the like, game reviews aren't normally like this, you know? It was a weird thing. And I was like, you know, and I was I was in uni for English lit at the time, and you know, I was thinking, man, this guy's so in depth and all that kind of, like, he's going into all this academic wank that I really enjoy. So yeah, it was that kind of that was the thing where I was like, oh, there are big words in this. that's different.
There are a lot of external factors that shape the way we talk about games, but obviously the biggest one is the games themselves. And games media, especially where it's at now, is so intertwined into game development that they can and do influence each other at times. You can't see a release of a difficult game without someone comparing it to Dark Souls, or have a game with subversive mechanics without it being compared to Undertale. We all have that one game that taught us, or at least sparked that interest to dive deeper into games. It could be because it grabbed you in a way that nothing else ever has before. It could have done something new that you've never seen done prior and want to dive deeper to find similar games, or maybe it hit you just right and connected like nothing has. For me, and millions of people across the world, the most important video game, at least in the modern memory of games discussion, is World of Warcraft.
So I played World of Warcraft for many, many, many years, too many hours. I'm afraid to look at how many hours I played in World of Warcraft. And I was a raid leader and a guild master at the same time. And we were, you know, we weren't like top of the world or anything. I was in a guild for a while that was high in the ranks in the US, but I wasn't in charge of that. But I had my own guild for many, many years. And I enjoyed explaining things. I enjoyed like pulling apart the mechanics in raids and trying to explain it to a lot of people that don't really play that many games. Like a lot of our raiders that we had, World of Warcraft was first of all, their first game ever that they played, and the only game that they ever played. So we had a team of people that were in it for the social aspect, and they also wanted to raid, but they didn't really have that gaming experience. So pulling apart mechanics in raids and trying to teach people that, you know, basically teach them how to play games for the first time, and tailoring the strategy around those kind of players really made me get a good feel for how things are put together. There were a lot of strategies available online in World of Warcraft for raids, and I was able to take what people were doing and like tinker with it and tailor it to our own group. And having learned that I really like explaining things and guiding people through, I was like, okay, well, maybe I should think about this, you know, with other games that I really enjoy.
Before World of Warcraft, massively multiplayer online role-playing games, or MMORPGs, or just MMOs, were really relegated to a select hardcore group of people, mainly in games like Phantasy Star Online and EverQuest. But WoW took an existing popular property and turned it into something that, at the time, was considered casual compared to those other MMOs, but still hard enough that people really had to crack it open to see how it ticked on the inside. Terms like mechanics started to become commonplace terms that previously were not used when discussing games, as it felt too much like a developer thing to say. Now it's something that even the most casual gamer, who may not have even touched WoW, throws around in everyday conversation. It really helped shape my language within games and how I talked about them. It was the first time I had to actively engage in community discussion in and out of game. Going to websites for third-party info wasn't a cheat sheet. It was the only way around boss fights with 25 other people. If I didn't want to be the reason we all died, I had to do my research and listen to the community. There was an evolving language around the game, one that has made its footing within the greater media discussion at large. Ever since that dam burst with more hardcore terminology, people are less and less afraid to use certain words when talking to their friends, although ludonarrative dissonance still seems to be off limits.
I think World of Warcraft has influenced pretty much every single game that's come out after World of Warcraft, because I think everyone played World of Warcraft, even if it was only just for a little bit. I think pretty much everyone at least knows about it and knows how it works, at least, even if they didn't touch it, you know?
It's not just World of Warcraft that gave me key terms to use when discussing the medium. Even games like Gone Home and Dear Esther gave us the term walking simulator, originally used derogatorily, that has now become its own genre entirely. This intersection between games and media dictating one another is only going to get tighter and tighter as time goes on, and I hope we aren't afraid to adopt language as it crops up.
There's no set way to do things anymore, so you can be as creative with it as possible, especially now that we have a lot of multimedia platforms like YouTube and like whatever websites are going to pop up later on. Like, I feel like that allows for more creativity, because at first the standard was just writing, and then it went on to actual visuals and video. And I think as that medium starts to shift and change, then it just allows for more people to do creative things with the way they talk about games.
Alongside with the ongoing influence of X-Play amongst all things video games journalism, other more serious YouTube channels began. The likes of Total Biscuit having moved from his time as a host on World of Warcraft radio, beginning a career as a Let's Player before moving on to more serious reviews and consumer advocacy. With that said, 2011 is where things really started to shift. You might be aware of a little YouTube series called Sequelitis.
I imagine that's going to be a point for a lot of people of Sequelitis kind of being one of the big things that they noticed first about games media, especially in this space. So yeah, I feel like when I was really starting to get into at least the involvement, you know, and like comedy, it was all more like comedy driven than analysis driven. When you go back and look at that old stuff, it's all like for the jokey joke, you know, there's not a ton of actual analysis in it. I mean, I'd say Sequelitis, there's a lot of both, but a lot of that stuff had that kind of using games as a comedy like a platform, which is interesting. That's how it started, really, and then people started taking the comedy a little bit out of it.
Aaron from Game Grumps, he did Sequelitis. That was another big one as well. Like that kind of time frame. I think like what, almost, is it 8 years ago or something? Somewhere around there. Those were the ones that really got me thinking about, oh wow, video game discussions can be much more than just basic reviews or just people fighting each other on forums and message boards online. They can be very structured. They can be more like visual essays, but also visual, like mini books even. I'm not going to call them a whole book because they're too short for that, but yeah, much more thorough discussions, sometimes a little too thorough.
But the one that kind of almost rewired my brain to think like, oh man, I could do this, was the Egoraptor Sequelitis series. That was where the Mega Man X one, just having someone kind of lay out the genius of that first level, and it was almost like you almost just kind of became a designer just by watching that, if you know what I mean? Or like it got you thinking like a designer, and I had never thought like that before. And it was like juice for my brain. It just kind of jazzed me up, and that was the first time I remember getting that feeling.
I can't say definitively that it changed everything for everyone, but for a lot of people, it did open the floodgates of deeper and more nuanced discussion of video games. Egoraptor took an idea of taking a game he loved and compared it to its sequel, sometimes positively like Mega Man X, and sometimes negatively like the Castlevania NES titles. The thing about these videos that particularly stood out to me the most was just how deeply the intro to Mega Man X was discussed. It was a deep dive into learning through gameplay and not intrusive tutorials, which today seems like an overplayed trope that most people will simply gloss over, but at the time it was new and refreshing. This felt like the transition from primary school to high school for games criticism, at least in video form. While some students were reading well above their literacy level already on their own time, Egoraptor took it to the mainstream. Being an already established personality through Newgrounds animation, he had a lot of eyes on his work, coupled with YouTube's, much kinder back then, algorithm. The video spread like wildfire. Gone were the days of private blog posts and forum discussions. Now was the time for YouTube to be the platform for deep discussions of games. While more comedic style reviews do and will always have their place, this was the start of something new. Finding a certain aspect of a game you loved or hated, and going in deep on that. This era wasn't without its teething issues, however. Since before, and including Sequelitis itself, comedy was king and dominated the flow of these videos. A lot of forced comedy was thrust into more serious analysis. And look, I'm guilty of this, and a lot of people influenced by Egoraptor also flirted with comedic delivery in their videos. Some people can pull it off in a way that complements their writing. Others, like me, could not, which is why I dropped that style, and those videos are long since privated. So as the consensus moved more towards a more serious tone that focused on the nitty-gritty, rather than wasting time and ruining pace with needless jokes.
Yeah, and when I look at my early content, like, that's 100% it. Like, I thought I was doing analysis, because I was like, well, this is what analysis is looking like for other people in this area. But it's like, no, it was all just setups for my shitty jokes, and I'm not funny. So, like, I was like, okay, maybe I should do actually analysis, which is, like, I've studied to do.
For me, I've always kind of taken the approach of the DIY stuff that you know, like you and I were kind of brought up on, where it's just like, you know, if you want to put on a show or you want to release something, then it's just like, okay, you make it yourself, you print the fucking sleeves, you print the posters, you do everything because not necessarily out of like a sense of pride or whatever, although, you know, you want to kind of be able to come out at the end and say like, yeah, I did this the way I wanted to do it, but also just because, well, if you don't do it, no one else is going to. So for me, it was a thing of, okay, I'm going to write this thing, I'm going to edit it myself, I'm going to make the music for it because, well, I guess what else am I going to do? You know, it's the kind of DIY approach from like being in bands and stuff really informed how I kind of approach this stuff, and like I see that mindset in a lot of creators, regardless of whether they were involved in a similar kind of, you know, music scene or whatever. Like, or it's you know, a lot of, like, the vast majority, I'm guessing, were not. But you know, it's a similar thing. You know, you have like the kind of bigger, more corporate stuff, and then, you know, you don't really have to pay attention to that if you're just focused on, you know, the necessity of making it happen yourself because no one else is going to do it for you.
For as similar as our influences may or may not have been, it seems that everyone had a different reason, need, or want to enter the discourse themselves. For me, personally, I had a bunch of ideas swelling around in my head that I'd never seen anyone talk about. If you go back and look at some of my earlier content, Star Fox 64's Metal System, Majora's Mask Dungeons, or how limitations push creativity, which, fun fact, was the first idea I ever had for a video. I'm not saying I was the only person in history to think of these things, but I'd never seen them written down, much less presented in a video. So I made a couple little quick looks at indie games to cut my teeth on how to talk into a microphone and edit videos together before I tackled the stuff I really wanted to.
I'd write, like, about like kind of 2013 or so, I'd start like writing these pieces and not posting them anywhere, but, or like, it was more that I really wasn't kind of finishing them. I would constantly just be going back and going over and over and over them and just never getting a finished piece done. And then it just so happened in kind of 2015, around about the time that Her Story was released, I played it, I loved it, and I was able to actually link that back to an essay that I'd just done in kind of postmodernism and postmodernist literature and all that stuff. And it was, you know, all about, like, the essay was all about, like, how, you know, Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov, it's the text of the book is, you know, pales in comparison to the paratext where the actual narrative is and stuff. And I was thinking, like, okay, this whole book is like a detective thing. This is like really experimental literature, and the reason it's experimental is because it's about the author giving control to the reader. And I was thinking, man, this is like really experimental literature, and it's doing things that games do on a very basic level. And so I was able to just kind of like link what Her Story was doing, which was very similar to what Pale Fire was doing, and it just kind of fit. And there it was. I had a finished piece. That was enough to be like, okay, I can make that into a video, I guess. And like I say, you know, my experience with games writing and stuff was mainly through video. So I thought, okay, well, I'll do video then. And yeah.
I think the first thing that I ever wrote on media, which was on games, was for a friend's zine that they made in high school. And this was a totally just kind of like hand printed, cut out, you know, real kind of indie thing. And she was just like, hey, you want to write something about anything? And I was like, sure. And so I wrote something about Hotline Miami first, and then I wrote something about I wrote something about like The Last of Us and Roger Ebert not calling games art. Like it was a very like the most kind of milquetoast mainstream gaming opinion kind of essay you could have. But you know, I was like 17. And yeah, so those were my first quote unquote published works. And then I wrote a little for my own blog, and then for some other websites, blogs, and then I interned at Game Informer, which is when, then it was legit.
I used to read the official Nintendo magazine when that was around, and that was basically it, and everything else was just stock reviews and stuff. So that's why when I saw his work, it was just like this whole new world, and I started watching your channel and like Rasputin's channel, and it's been great. It's been very eye-opening. There's just so many different ways in which you can talk about games that are just so much more creative, so I really like exploring that.
A lot of different things. One was petty, and it was spite. I was annoyed that Dark Souls 2 was getting really slammed critically. Again, it wasn't really by reviewers, it was mostly by people on YouTube and discussing it, which is where I find usually there's more in-depth conversations. Reviewers, and this is going to sound like I'm slamming reviewers, but it's not the case at all. I feel very sympathetic to reviewers on big sites that have a very strict time frame. Hey, you have to play this long-ass game, and you have to have your review done on this date, or else you're letting everyone down because the first person who gets their review out gets all the clicks, all that shit. Like, I feel very bad for that, and I would not do that job well at all. But yeah, the Dark Souls 2 reviewed well, but then there was all this criticism that came out afterwards from people that could spend more time playing it, and it was something that I enjoyed. Dark Souls 2. I knew that Dark Souls 2 was worse than Dark Souls 1, but I felt like it was getting unfairly slammed, whereas Dark Souls 1 did a lot of the things that Dark Souls 2 did badly as well. The difference is that Dark Souls, it's not like, oh well, sequels should get better, so therefore if Dark Souls 2 does something bad that Dark Souls 1 also did, then it should get harshly criticized for it. It's like no one ever complained about this in Dark Souls 1. So it was kind of like there was a pettiness to it that, I'm annoyed that people are being mean to this game, so I want to show them that they should be being mean to the first one as well, which is kind of stupid looking back, but that was kind of a big reason, yeah.
That I don't actually know. It kind of just happened. I feel like I'm still getting into it. Like, it all just kind of ended up this way, but I guess I've always been subconsciously moving towards it. I love just analyzing things to death. I love shooting the breeze about games. Getting something you like a piece of media you like, and just kind of tearing it open and doing almost like an autopsy on it is just... There's just something so fun about that.
I realized I wanted to start writing specifically about... Because before I started to do YouTube videos, then I started off sort of in video game journalism. But prior to that, then I went to school for English and journalism, so it kind of all tied in. But there was a gaming website that I was freelancing for, and I started writing articles about the games that I was playing. It wasn't necessarily 5 out of 5 kind of review stuff. It was kind of like the stuff I do now, except it was just in the form of writing. And that was probably 2009, 2010.
Unfortunately, as much as being an independent creator is amazing, we're constantly at the mercy of our chosen platform. And YouTube likes to change things without warning and devoid of explanation, and the algorithm is an unkind king. In 2014, YouTube changed their algorithm to favor watch time over views, meaning the longer people stayed on your videos, the more likely they were to promote your videos. This hit animation channels the hardest, but it also meant that short, bite-sized analysis was no longer viable if you wanted more eyes on your ideas. Short impressions were becoming old-fashioned, and longer, more in-depth videos got the favoritism from YouTube. With this change, a channel by the name of Matthew Matosa started to gain some traction. Matthew takes long and very deep looks at every aspect of games such as Portal, the Zelda series, Mario 64, and so on, all sitting around 25 to 40 minutes, which now seems par for the course, but back then they were on the longer side of content available. All of this came to a head in 2016 with his 6-hour play-by-play look at Dark Souls, sitting at over 1 million views. It showed the world was willing to, and actively wanted, incredibly long-form content about video games going in as deep as humanly possible. Video is now the ruler of the seas, and for good reason. An emotional and personal connection to not only the games we play, but those who are talking about them, is what defines the later to current era of gaming criticism.
It has become 1000% more personal and anecdotal, and I think that's for the best, because that's there will always be interesting takes as long as people are just being upfront about how they felt about a game. It's like 15 years ago, it was literally just people telling you stuff you could have found out on the back of the box, just, you know, multiplayer aspects, cel-shaded graphics, just kind of listing bullet points. But, like, now games writing is people almost giving, like, they're still reviews, but they're fused in, some are more seamless than others, but just kind of, like, personal experiences, and I'm more excited to find out how people feel about games rather than just, like, saying how the game is. I think there's a good marriage of personal experience and actually, like, telling you what's what in a game nowadays than there ever was.
It's weird because in some ways it feels kind of like yesterday, but when I think back to what yesterday actually was, you know, it's the idea of anyone can do this has been taken to to its logical conclusion, and now everyone is fucking doing it. It's like video essays. You know, like video essays are kind of they're a massive thing now, and it's great. It really is, like, cool to see. I mean, it was one of these things when I started out, I didn't really know anyone else that was kind of doing this, and it was, you know, then you get into it and you realize, oh shit, there's like Super Bunny Hop, Mark Brown, Errant Signal and stuff that have been doing this stuff on YouTube for ages. They had, like, I mean, I seen a few of these videos kind of randomly and stuff, but I hadn't really, like, checked into that whole scene. And just in the years since, that has, like, blown up to ridiculous proportions and stuff. Like, that is, like, it is blown up, but it's still very much a niche thing, and I think it will continue to grow, but I think it will still like kind of retain that niche.
With this newfound sense of anyone can do it and the popularity of personal stories, mixed in with an extremely low barrier to entry that was YouTube, basically if you had a microphone and some editing software, you could make your work published. More people were doing games criticism than ever. This became a double-edged sword. More and more diverse experiences were getting told, from reviews of old games to extremely niche takes, but it was becoming an ever-expanding ocean of creators to sift through.
So I think how it's changed comes from new voices who have gotten into the scene. I do have an exception, but I think it's almost impossible to get into the scene now by just making Breath of the Wild review or Outer Wilds review or whatever. Obviously the two best games ever, but whatever review. I don't think that model works for new creators. The exception I would kind of say is long form stuff, but even that I think is harder to get into now. But I'd say that was, like, the most recent, like, people kind of being able to, because Matthew Matosis for a while was, like, the dude who did it, and then a few others have kind of hit the scene and been pretty successful at it, who are a little bit newer. I mean, like Joseph Anderson and KingK, and I think that's still a hard one to get into. But so now the way it's changed, and I think it's really the new generation of creators who are kind of changing it, because they're like, okay, I could try to make a review on this game, but no one's gonna fucking watch it because everyone's made a video on Ocarina of Time already. No one needs my opinion on why the water temple's bad.
That's hard to say. I mean, since I first got into it probably like 5 years ago or something in earnest, it doesn't seem that's a short amount of time. But I think the obvious answer, but one that I'm really happy with, is just kind of like awareness of games' place in society and an examination of how games are playing into issues like class and race and gender and all of that. You know, the pejorative term would probably be like woke criticism or SJW writers or whatever, but every other form of art is analyzed in this way. You know, we have feminist theory for movies and have had that for 50 years, and we've got, the fact that we are now kind of talking about games as something that are worth analyzing using these metrics, that they're not just dumb stories, and because of that then they can actually, like, they have to be held responsible for the themes they're using, is really fascinating. And that's, again, there have been people doing that forever, but those voices have gotten more mainstream in just the past few years, and that's really satisfying for me to see.
Like, you have to have an angle. And I think for a while, especially after sequelitis, there were a lot of people that were trying to find like that thing under the stone that no one had talked about, right? With any given game. What that actually is perspective. And that's how it's changed. Are people trying to find unique perspectives on something, usually personal perspectives or just things that like maybe were obvious that should have been talked about but haven't been.
Not only were more interesting voices and more diverse stories being told, the art of making video is possibly the best way to present an argument about games. Since it's a very visual and active medium, it requires visuals to back it up.
Video games benefit much more from having the visual examples supporting your arguments. Even if it's just a review, just being able to see the game is just so much better than having to like translate it from the writer's experience into the words, into reading what you think that they mean, and it's just way better to just see it on the screen. So I think the video format is when I started noticing a big change between what I was reading before. I think that was the big one.
I think my recent Death Stranding video, like the ending, has this song from the game called BB's Theme, which is just the most emotional song in the world, especially because of the context of the game it's used in. So using that music at the end of my video made it like 10 times more emotional, which is amazing.
Amid this explosion of popularity, a lot of the old guard of online publications, even the physical magazines, made the shift to more personal stories in a way they hadn't really before.
Pivot to video was a thing like a couple of years ago where you saw all these fucking publications just trying to, like, you saw a lot of publications trying to ape the video essay thing, and some, you know, to wildly varying degrees of success. I think you'll probably continue to see some of that. But I mean, it's also just like, in some ways it's hard to be optimistic about where all this stuff is going, because you just think, well, advertising revenue is just going down and down and down, and I think it's moving in a kind of weirdly nebulous direction where it's completely democratized, and I think that, you know, you're going to just have everyone being able to offer kind of high production value opinions regardless of their abilities as like a writer or anything like that. I mean, it all kind of, I mean, on some level it all kind of depends on the whims of the algorithm.
But around this time, something more sinister was happening within games discourse that forced a dramatic shift in how we discuss the medium, and that was Gamergate.
You know, I think some of the best writing in game spheres that I read, especially early on, were actually responses to Gamergate. And it's weird because it's absolutely like, I don't want to be like an ends justify the means or whatever thing, but what is interesting is that Gamergate was so unbelievably and unignorably toxic that I feel like it forced other critics to be like, okay, since we're not that, clearly we have to talk about the same issues that they're talking about, but we're going to be intelligent people about it, you know? And so before that, everyone kind of seemed like they were pretending games weren't political. And ironically, even though the Gamergaters would say that they hated the idea of games being political, they forced that conversation into the mainstream. And so in response, everyone, I feel like, was just like, fuck it, we're doing it. Let's get political. I think that some of the best writers that we have today were actually forged in the fires of Gamergate. But there are also dozens of other people, I'm sure, who were absolutely forced out of the conversation or scared away because they knew that if they entered this, they might get doxxed, their family might get harassed, you know, any of the horrible shit that people were doing. And so it is still, I think, a net negative on our media climate. I think game criticism is worse because of Gamergate, but I think that the ways that people responded and fought back have actually done really positive work in shaping where our critical sphere is today.
For those unaware, Gamergate was a harassment campaign targeted initially towards Zoe Quinn and then spreading out to many, many other marginalized people in the community, under the thinly veiled guise of ethics and video game journalism. I won't go into the details of what happened then. There are plenty of videos you can watch on the topic. It's not really my conversation to be having since I wasn't involved, and sat more as a bystander back then. I want to make one thing very clear. Gamergate was horrible. It helped coordinate and normalize online hate campaigns and group together far-right extremists. But again, there are plenty of videos online you can watch about that. I want to talk about how it shifted games discourse for better or worse. As Jacob said, it ironically politicized games discussions, something that previously was written and read about unblinkingly. All games are political, whether you want to admit it or not. There's inherent readings that can be pulled from most, if not all, games. Even those abstaining from the conversation is a political statement in and of itself. Apolitical is still political. The effects of Gamergate are still very much seen today. We see it when a professional gaming journalist has a take, like they didn't enjoy Final Fantasy VII Remake demo, or when a game dares to have representation of women, people of color, or the LGBTQ community. We see it when a reviewer plays a game badly and a call for blood is made on them. There are dozens and dozens of ways to get an insight on a game today. Something I haven't touched on yet is Let's Play and streaming, which isn't strictly games criticism, but it is still an important part of our entire ecosystem as a whole. A lot of games are sold purely on the basis that they saw their favorite Let's Player, well, play it, either out of pure enjoyment, some kind of meme state, or just to finish it before they do. Having that immediate and direct feed of exactly what a game is like, even in the first moments, is more valuable to some than trying to rely on someone else's words or ideas they bring forth.
Like, Undertale doesn't become Undertale, and Minecraft doesn't become Minecraft, you know, without YouTube and Twitch and people playing it, and then someone else will be like, oh, fuck, cool, I'm gonna do it now. Like, it's wild, but, like, the amount of games that I'm sure, like, fucking Markiplier is responsible for selling, essentially, is gotta be wild. 100% those creators just sold so many fucking copies.
We like to celebrate on downfalls rather than accomplishments of those around us.
The more negative reviews and videos get a lot of attention, a lot of critiques, stuff like that, and while I do think there's a place for it, it can sometimes be overly negative for what it is, and just complaining about things in games which really don't matter that much for the sake of I guess views and attention. I don't know, I just think it's overly negative when really we should be speaking more about what works in games and what makes us really feel something and love games instead of what makes us hate them. I don't know, that's just my personal opinion. I just think it's nicer to discuss like the good stuff rather than just constantly negative.
Because of the net losses of Gamergate, that's kind of where we're at in regards to games media. It's a clear divide between those who use negativity to sell their content, or those who like to tell stories that are personal to them, either through an analytical lens or a more personal one.
Everyone's kind of doing their own thing, but it doesn't matter if you review something someone else has reviewed now. You're not stepping on anybody's toes. It's really cool.
With that said, it's easy to curate your own viewing, reading, and listening experiences online now. With so much different kinds of content out there, from chilled, laid-back podcasts, to deep dive documentaries, to long-form critique, and everything in between, you really can pick and choose what you want out of your games media. And finding that perfect person, group of people, or show that really reflects you and your ideas of games, and really, that's so exciting. Much like World of Warcraft to me, games today are evolving, and the games are getting discussed and even developed in ways we never could have imagined when we were pilfering through magazines to read. With today's publisher need for constant online communities or games as a service, developers are working closer than ever with their communities, not just journalists, YouTubers, or podcasters, but everyone, to get all the perspectives possible on how not to only improve the experience for everyone, but how to map out the future updates and where to go even further down the line. This feels like just the beginning of this kind of developer and community relationships. In closing this out, I think it's fun and also important to speculate on the future. However, the future is scary and uncertain. With algorithms dictating content, as well as monetization pools getting spread further and stretching even more thin, it's hard to imagine where we might end up. Has games criticism really plateaued? Or is there something just around the corner that no one can really predict? At this point, I've listened to my friends and wonderful guests answer this question too many times to have my own opinion on the matter anymore. So I'll let them give their insights and where things might be going for a bit.
Really hard to say because I wanted to say, if you asked me this question a few years back when, you know, people were still watching television, then I would have said that games media would have transitioned better onto television, like actual cable TV, and would have had a place to thrive there. But it almost feels like with the cultural shift, then that's like no longer a priority for people anymore, right? So it's kind of hard to say where it would be 5 years from now, because I feel like it has a lot to do with how technology changes and like how people are consuming media.
I think it'll be interesting over the next couple of years to see which creators become kind of the new voices, assuming that YouTube doesn't collapse as... Because that's where I think a lot of games media comes from, is YouTube. Obviously, there are the major publications, but YouTube's getting far more traffic on a regular basis. I think it'll be interesting to see which creators step up and become kind of the voices. Because if you look at, I think, people who are gaining popularity really quick, it is all people doing kind of weird stuff. And as I said before, like, it's all about perspectives and providing something new. Fucking Nakey Jakey exploded in popularity because he hit that intersection of like legitimate game analysis and like, I'm a sad boy, you know, who has gone through shit. And I think that kind of voice appeals to a lot of people. So I think games media and games criticism is going to get a lot more personal as time goes on. In our for better or worse, in our parasocial hell, people want that. People want authenticity, and people want shared experiences, especially shared experiences with creators that they like.
Over the next 10, maybe 20 years, I think it's going to take that long, we're going to see more of the gaming language that is used to describe things settle, properly like solidify. And we're going to have a much more effective vocabulary for discussing things. And I think this is going to sound hypocritical coming from me, one of the people that makes the longest videos about games on YouTube. I think we're going to see videos gradually get shorter and shorter and more efficient at communicating. I think there is going to be room for longer videos because video games are, for the most part, so much more complex than movies. That doesn't mean they're better, it just means they're more complex because usually a video game is a much longer movie than a movie. Plus, it has the whole gameplay system on top of that. So I think they're always going to need a lot of time to discuss both sides, especially if runtimes of games continue to be very, very long. But I think in general, we're going to be moving toward a more effective and efficient language to describe these things. And I think that will transfer over to the professional reviews. I'm also hoping that some professional reviewers didn't start playing games until later on in their lives, and I think that's the more experience they get, that's going to help as well. But again, that's out of my area, and that's just me speculating. That's anecdotal. I don't really have much evidence to back that up. So I think we're going to be seeing that get better.
I think we'd all be fools to ignore streaming and how that's going to come into play more with maybe analysis, maybe more live analysis, maybe more real-time stuff. Although I think you're never going to get rid of scripted things per se, so it's hard to say, really. It seems like it's kind of plateauing into a cool environment, though. I'll say that. Like, that's... Like, I like where it's at the moment. The age that I am and what I grew up reading, I will always miss gaming magazines. I wish there would be a renaissance. I don't know how you'd do it, because just the climate we're in does not support magazines, like physical magazines, but, you know, I was in the punk scene long enough to know that like, fanzines are always going to be a thing. Like, photocopied fanzines. Maybe one day we'll get video game zines in the style of DIY punk pamphlets. I don't know.
I used to view games criticism as this whole thing of like, okay, you have a preview cycle, and then you have the review, which is the final score, and that is like the end of it. And now I kind of view it as like this kind of... It sounds wanky, but it's like this kind of ongoing tapestry of just like perspectives and opinions on a game that just kind of keeps going and keeps flowing and stuff like that. And I think that's a much more interesting way to to look at it. It means that there's no game for which everything possible has been said, and I think that's an exciting prospect rather than thinking like, okay, this is the definitive verdict on this game.
Thank you for watching another episode of The Language of Video Games. This one took a very long time to make, as you can probably tell by the length, and I'm sorry for such a big gap between uploads. But this one was important for me to get right, and I hope I've done that here today. As time goes on, I want video games to have their own terminology used when talking about them, and that was kind of the goal with this video. We're partway there now, but until we have a dedicated degree in strictly games writing, I don't know if we'll truly be able to achieve that. Looking back on our history as critics, what came before us, and what might come next, was really interesting. But what I want to know is your story with games writing. Who was your first channel, journalist, podcaster? Or what got you thinking deeper about those games? Do you write yourself? Who inspired you? Please let me know. I also want to shout out everyone who took the time to answer my questions and appear in this massive project. You can check them all out below. They're all amazing and worth your time if you've never seen their stuff before. And until next time, take care.